All right. I think we should probably get started here. Good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here on the 15th of May. I can't believe how quickly we've come through this spring, which has been, I think, for all of us, very eventful. Bonjour, Patrick. So I am, as I said, delighted to be here. We're going to be talking today. We have about an hour, a little less than an hour, to talk about how do we kick our virtual team interactions up a notch. So what are some of the tools that we have, as well as what do we know from research that helps to tell us how to better interact in our virtual teams. And this can be either from the role of being a peer on a virtual team or being a leader. I'm coming to you today. I'm Jennifer Jordan. I'm a professor of leadership and organizational behavior here at IMD. And you see that on the left of my slides is the lovely symbol for the logo for the program that I run called Leading in the Digital Age. And this program is a sort of a larger 2.5-day program on how to lead at your best in a time of digital disruption. And what we're covering today, leading in virtual teams, is a small snippet, a snapshot of what that larger program looks like. I'm just going to stop one thing. You're going to see that. I want to just try to see if I can move my screen a bit, but no. Okay, no problem. So by the end of the hour, I hope that we will understand what distinguishes virtual from non-virtual teams, learn some techniques for increasing the teaminess or the cohesion of our virtual teams, discover ways to understand better how your virtual team interacts at a various point in time, and understand how to think about staffing your virtual team. So who should be on that virtual team? Who exists best in a virtual environment? And to know how to better act in our virtual environments as well as both peers and leaders. So that's what I hope to accomplish here today. I'm going to start by showing a funny video. I hope this all gets you laughing on a Friday morning. Maybe you've already seen it, but it always makes me smile, and I think it is so true in terms of how we interact nowadays. One thing to mention is that we have no ability to hear you. So you are all muted, and you unfortunately will stay that way throughout the entire time. So the only way I can see you right now is by what you type in the Q&A room. I have set aside some time for questions at the very end. So hopefully I'll have some time to address the questions that you type. And then we will also, I will be checking throughout the session into the Q&A to see if there's maybe a relevant question that I can address at a separate point in time. So I don't see you, I don't hear you, but you can type your question and answer as well as comments in that Q&A window here on the side. So that is how I get to see you. I'm going to play this little video just to bring a smile on your face today. And I see Albert, you're joining from Melbourne, so it's the evening. So I hope this makes you have a laugh before you go to bed tonight.
Hey, Paul. Thanks for being here on time. Paul? Hey, Paul, can you hear me?
I can't hear you.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Hey, guys.
Oh, hey, Tyler.
Sorry I'm late. Having a hard time connecting.
1 second. Paul's having a sound issue.
I can't hear you.
Try adjusting your output settings.
Can you hear me?
It's the gear icon.
Tyler, are you on hotel Wi-Fi?
Yeah, why?
Never mind, I got it. I just had to change a few settings.
Great. Maybe we can get started then. Oh, great.
I think your mic is picking up your speakers.
Mike,
Do you have headphones?
you want me to put them on?
No, I want you to smell them. No, I want you to put them on. Hey, Beth.
Hey everyone, sorry I'm late. I had to download a new version of the platform.
You should plan extra time for the updates. There's pretty much one every time.
Sounds like someone just joined.
Hey guys, it's John. I had to call in. I'm stuck in traffic. Have I missed anything yet?
No, it would have been nice for you to join the rest of us, but we'll see you when you get home. All right, while everyone is here, finally, Tyler, do you have that financial report?
Well, it's been the last few weeks updating our books, and I got some great news for you. schedule from this point last year. We had a great Q1.
We lost Tyler, I think.
Am I frozen?
Hey, Trip, I think we lost Tyler.
Yeah, I know we lost Tyler.
Hey guys, it sounded like Tyler was cutting out.
We know, John. All right, while we wait on Tyler, why don't we go over all of the reports from Beth, are you with us?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, everyone, I know some of you have to leave soon, but I just wanted to go over a couple of the queries before. Okay, excuse me. My wife's out of town this week. Daddy's, I'm so sorry. Okay, you just spilt grape juice on the carpet. Daddy.
People in the chat room are asking for a link to the video, so I will add that to my slide so that you can share it with your colleagues at home. But I think, we all laugh at it, but it is our lives, or it has been our lives for the last few weeks. I think we can all identify with almost every character in here. The one who's checking their email while they are in the Zoom room, the father who has his kids at home running all around, the person who's on their phone while everyone else is on video, the guy who's freezing in the middle of the conference call. So we laugh at it, but it is our reality, and it might be our reality for the near future as well, right? We talk about the new normal, but we don't even know what the new normal is. So today we're going to be talking about some best practices when we are working in a team environment, but virtually. And I see that Albert in Melbourne said he's sitting there with a nice glass of wine. It's a little bit too early for that here. I have my tea, and no, Starbucks is not sponsoring today's webinar, just so you know. Okay, so humans are social creatures. We know that we are born and we have evolved in a social environment. We see, our mom and our dad right when we're born, and we connect for that first time with a human being. But we connect with that human being in a face-to-face environment, in a real environment. And the question is, how does our body and our brain react differently when we are now interacting with people in a two-dimensional environment? So we thrive as humans on social interactions, and we know actually from looking at fMRI studies, so functional magnetic resonance imaging studies, that people's brains, especially the emotional parts of their brains, don't activate the same way in a virtual setting as in a real life setting. So we already know that we as humans respond differently, and we have no control over that. It's just the way our brains work. And perhaps 1,000 years from now, when our brains are evolved at a different stage, that's going to be different. But for now, we're still humans that are used to working in a face-to-face real environment. So I'm going to be talking today, as I said, about virtual teams, but that question is like, well, what is a virtual team? So I had an interaction yesterday with one of my colleagues at an insurance company, or one of my clients at an insurance company up in Zurich. And they said, well, it's really different because some of my virtual teams are accidental virtual teams. Because of COVID, we're forced to go virtually. We weren't prepared for that. Whereas some of my virtual teams are intentional virtual teams. We were formed in order to be a virtual team. That's what our expectations were when we started. And my interactions in my accidental virtual teams are very different than in my intentional, because we have a different expectation. So here today, when we're going to talk about virtual teams, the question is, what is a virtual team? And there has been research on virtual teams, and there's a way that researchers give a score to a team of how virtual or face-to-face they are. So first of all, start thinking about, how virtual are my teams? The more virtual they are, the more what we talk about today will apply. So there are 3 dimensions to think about when we think about virtual teams. The first one is the percentage of time, of total interaction time, spent using virtual tools. And when I say virtual tools, I mean things like phone, Skype, email, WhatsApp, Jabber, Slack, all of these virtual tools. The more time relative to the total time of interaction that you spend using these tools, the more virtual you are as a team. Richness of information shared. So how rich is that information shared? Are you using images? Are you using videos? Are you using voice, right? So those are all rich forms of interaction. The more rich that interaction, the less virtual the team is considered. The less rich, the more virtual, okay? So that's kind of a negative relationship with that variable. And then synchronous communication versus asynchronous communication. The more asynchronous the communication, meaning email, right? I send an email, I have to wait, a day, an hour, a week to get a response. That's asynchronous. The more virtual the team. So in thinking about how virtual is my team, think about these three factors. The less time we spend in these virtual tools, the less virtual we are. The more rich the information that we share, the less virtual we are. And the more synchronous, the less virtual we are, right? And the opposite goes for more virtual teams. And again, I'm looking at the question and answer. Yes, I will definitely share a link to the video. And the one I showed here this morning is a shortened version. I just cut it down. So when I share the link, you'll be able to see the full version. So here's some examples. I have a PhD student team at a university in the Netherlands. And because I don't live in Holland anymore, I work mainly virtually with that team. So we use a lot of virtual tools. We are using Zoom, we use email, we use telephone, all of that. So that's high use of virtual tools relative to face-to-face. Informational richness, though, is pretty high. We're using video chat, we use voice, we send videos to one another. So the informational richness is high, meaning it's maybe less virtual. And the synchronicity is low, however. So it is more virtual. We're doing mostly emails and sending information via email. So that would mean that, the use of virtual tools is high, informational richness is also high, but synchronicity is low. So it's a moderately strong virtual team. In contrast, I have a client a team here at IMD. We're also using a lot of virtual tools. The informational richness of those tools is a bit lower, mostly just email. And we have low levels of synchronicity. So again, we are sending things not through live video chat, but more through email. So again, I get a different score than I do for my other team in terms of the level of virtualness. And Bujol asked, is non-virtual is face-to-face? Basically, yes. So you can think about a continuum, virtual to face-to-face or to real life, right? And yes, we will be, because I cannot read Cyrillic, I cannot say your name, but yes, we will be sending the slides afterwards. So we get together here today to talk about virtual teams, which implies that there's something unique and more difficult about virtual team interactions than real life team or face-to-face team interactions. But we know that there are actually some advantages to virtual teams. There's some things that are easier in virtual teams than in face-to-face teams. So first of all, we know from research that people feel less inhibited by group norms and social pressures in virtual environments. They feel more like they can be themselves. And which is interesting. And maybe that has to do with, your background, you're in your office, you're in a place of comfort. This is my office. Sometimes I take it from my home. So I kind of maybe feel it's more personalized for me. There's also feelings of greater social equalization, meaning that people tend to feel, rather in comparison to a face-to-face interaction, that people are more equal. Okay, so maybe in a face-to-face team, your boss sits at the head of the table. That's not as salient or as obvious when you are in a virtual room. Although I have to say that this point came to question in my mind this last week when I had a virtual Zoom meeting with a project team, and one person joined the call, and I'm pretty much sure that she lived in a palace. And I asked her, I'm like, is that your actual home? She's like, oh yeah. And then I was in a very small office, and actually one member of the team was in a closet, literally in a closet, because he said that was the only place that he could get peace and quiet in his house. So maybe this one in the current world is perhaps not always true, but in general, people feel more socially equalized. Reduced feelings of evaluation apprehension. People feel less judged in a virtual environment than they do face-to-face. And we find that people are actually more likely to be direct and open in a virtual environment. And Albert, you asked an interesting question. He said, so can you be virtual and share similar locations? Yes, you can. However, I'm going to say, however, one thing to keep in mind is that, and this is a piece of advice that my colleague Ina Togel gave, is in a virtual team interaction, it's not actually good to have some people together face to face and some people virtual, because then there will be feelings of inequality. It's like, oh, you guys are all together and I'm somehow out. So that was an interesting piece of takeaway from my colleague Ina that I think about now in my virtual teams. What's also a benefit is that there's more record of communication and decision making. So you can refer back to it, unlike a face-to-face meeting. I mean, I know that it would be very awkward for me if I was in a face-to-face meeting and someone comes in and says, oh, can we record this meeting? I'd be like, well, why do you want to record it? But in a virtual meeting, it's very common that the meetings are recorded and we don't think as much of it, or we tend to be more allowing of it. Greater opportunity to weigh, consider, and digest information, especially if we're working asynchronously, right? We have more time to digest. But face-to-face teams still certainly have their advantages. So number one, there's less potential for miscommunication in face-to-face. We know this because we're not only hearing people's voices, but we're also reading their body language. We know what they really mean. If they're being sarcastic, we're more easily able to read that. Greater ability, as I said, to use nonverbal cues, which helps with the miscommunication. Greater warmth among members. So people report feeling more warm and cohesive in face-to-face teams than in virtual teams. Now, I should say that all of this research obviously comes from pre-COVID times, because COVID times are too recent to actually do reliable research on it now. So maybe this is changing. You know, as we start to do the cocktails virtually, as we start to do more, sharing of our home lives, maybe our kids come on the screen, perhaps this last one is changing, but at least pre-COVID, people feel less warm. And we have less disjointed asynchronous communication. So you can ask for more clarification. There's less likelihood, as I said, for miscommunication. Things tend to be a bit smoother when we are working face-to-face. So today we're going to be talking about how do we capitalize on the advantages of virtual teams, but also compensate for some of the weaknesses. And Ricardo says, what about body language? Many people don't switch the camera on. So great point. As I said, we as humans have evolved to read body language, not only facial expressions, not only voice. And certainly like in a Zoom conversation, you can see my shoulders, but you can't see what my hands or my feet are doing, which is also important information for us to take into our brains. I have a rule, and many of us, when we teach, for example, at IMD, we have the rule that camera, if one person's camera is on, then everyone's camera has to be on, unless you have a really, really good excuse for it, like you're in the car. But then we ask people to let us know ahead of time that they won't be able to switch on their cameras. So I tend to make that a rule, and I think that maybe is good practice. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the number one most predictive variable for team effectiveness. Okay, and this is virtual teams or face-to-face teams. It doesn't matter. This is what predicts more than anything else team effectiveness, which is how teams share information. Okay, so there's two types of information sharing that can go on in teams. The first one, the researchers call open information sharing. This is merely the sheer volume of information that is shared within a team. It might be information that everybody knows, and it might be information that has no relevance to the task at hand. Meaning, for example, if I talk about the football match last night, right? Okay, there's not really football matches right now, but let's imagine that there was a football match last night that all of my team members also watched, and I talk about that in my team. That would be open information sharing. Maybe everyone has watched that game, that match. Maybe it has nothing to do, or I assume it would have nothing to do with the task at hand unless you work for FIFA. And we're sharing that information just to get a conversation started, okay? Just to maybe connect with our teams. That's open information sharing. On the other side is the unique information sharing. That's sharing information that's privy to only a few members of the team or maybe one person, and normally it has to do with the task at hand. And we find that 40% of the variance in team effectiveness is explained by how much open relative to unique information a team shares, with the more open information that a team shares, leading to more effectiveness. And teams that share more open relative to unique information feel more cohesive, they feel more connected to one another, they feel more teamy, like a team. Now, what's interesting is that you would assume, okay, effectiveness has to do with the task. It's important to share unique information that's related to the task, but actually it's that cohesion that's important to team effectiveness. So something interesting to keep in mind here. And I want to ask you, this is our first poll question. What type of team do you think shares more open relative to unique information? And we're going to get into some of the why. I want to first do the poll. So here's poll 1. I'm going to launch that poll. Which type of team shares more open relative to unique information, face-to-face or virtual? I'm going to share the results. I think you can see them now. So 64% of you said face-to-face, 36% of you said virtual. Tell me if you said face-to-face, why do you think, maybe type it in, why do you think face-to-face teams share more open rather than unique? I'm going to stop sharing the poll here. I want to look at the question and answer chats because I don't think we have a chat room here. So I'm looking at the question and answer page. Face-to-face. So if you said face-to-face, why don't you feel less mechanic? It's more natural, as Giselle said. Tracy, face-to-face teams have more organic opportunities for casual interactions. Absolutely. The ability to have one-to-ones in the meeting room before, that's a good one. So I just miss where the ability to have more one-on-ones. Trying to see who said that. People feel less judged and tend to be more direct. Absolutely. So research has said absolutely that face-to-face teams tend to have more casual, more kind of organic interactions, which leads to more than open information sharing. For those of you who said unique, those of you who said virtual teams have more open relative to unique information sharing. Why do you think virtual teams? I don't see any more questions coming up. Okay, so we tend to, trust. Okay, Saeed says trust. Maybe you're feeling less trust. You're waiting for people to connect. Sure, and there's all these things also in virtual environments that sort of separate our interactions, or they interrupt our interactions. So we all have been on those calls where one person hasn't joined yet. You're waiting for them, and then another person drops out, and all of that means that mentally we say, okay, we need to get to the task. We can't waste any more time. Oh, we only have an hour now. And all that uses up time. So we tend to be more kind of task oriented in virtual teams, which for those of us who are maybe a bit more introverted, we don't like to talk as much. That's really nice for you in a virtual team, but it tends to reduce the open information sharing. We're going to talk about how to get around that later on. So what are the advantages of open information sharing? We see here that it's more strongly related to team cohesion, and team cohesion, how kind of collected a team feels, is related to team satisfactions. And in general, and again, this research was done pre-COVID, virtual teams report less satisfaction on a mean level, on an average level, than do face-to-face teams. Open information sharing, OIS, builds the social structures necessary to bring in important emotions into team interaction. So it helps people to bond. It helps people to have the positive emotions that are necessary for good bonded interactions. As I said, it builds greater team trust when we share open information. Maybe we talk about our dinner last night we had with our family. It gives us a window into people's lives. And as I said, it also sets that stage for important interpersonal processes. And in virtual teams, when we share that open information, it helps to compensate for that social void. As I said, it connects us to people. It makes them feel more real. So how can you get your virtual teams, if they're not already, if you're in that 65% that said face-to-face teams share more open information, how do you get your teams to share more open information? And hi, Ian, I see you're on there. So it's good to see a familiar name. What we do here in virtual teams is, as a leader, set the tone. So I have, for example, one leader I work with, he's a CEO, and he says that every virtual team meeting he's had, he sets like a funny question that the day before that they're going to discuss that day. So like today you're going to come in and have to talk about what did you eat for dinner last night? Or what is your favorite streaming TV series that you're watching at the moment? So every meeting starts with something that is maybe not fully open because it's unique, but something that's not task related. Or, another group that I have is watching a series, the TV series together. And they say that's a way that kind of, it gives them something to talk about besides the task at hand and helps them to bond. Cold call as a leader. We all have those teams where there's that one person that just doesn't talk as much. Feel free to call on them and say, okay, what is your opinion? Asking them to bring in their opinion just to get that conversation started, to start sharing that information. Relatedly require that everyone on the team says something in every call. As I said, we always have that one team member that we hardly hear from. How do you get them to join in? And we also know that using more informal tools like WhatsApp or Trello helps get that open information sharing. People are going to post funny videos, memes on that. And it's not task related, but it helps people to feel more bonded. So think about in your teams, how can you start to get people to share more open information? This comes from my previous colleague. He was a visiting professor here. And he does research on virtual teams. And he said what's really important for virtual teams, if possible, and I know in COVID this wasn't always possible, but it's important to have around 72 hours or 3 working days of face-to-face interactions before a team goes virtual. And what he said this does is it helps to form that teaminess, that team cohesion. But what he said it was also really important is when a team is about 72 hours together face-to-face, they start to be able to read each other's nonverbals and understand that, okay, when Tom, is sitting back, it's normally when Tom is feeling less engaged, or when Christina is sitting like this, it means that she doesn't agree. So it's important to have teams have a little bit of time ahead of time to work face-to-face and work virtually, but face-to-face, like meaning behind their screens, but in a real life interaction environment before they go virtual, so they can start to read each other and start to have those kind of side conversations around their screens. And so he always recommends, if it is possible, to have a few days of face-to-face interactions before you go virtual. And as I said, it is not always possible during COVID times, but maybe think about it for your intentional virtual teams in the future. Another thing I would always recommend is that teams use what are known as experience sampling apps, or ESAs. And what these are is they're apps that you can put on your phone or your iPad as a leader of the team, and ask every other member of the team to have one as well. And as a leader of the team, depending on which ESA you choose, you can set the questions, or the questions come chosen by the app. So if you do a really cheap version, a free version, the app chooses the questions. If you have one of the more expensive ones, you can choose the question. And what you do is you can set it to either certain times of the day or randomly. It pops up on your team member screen and it says a question like, do you feel happy right now? Or how happy do you feel? How relaxed do you feel? How awake do you feel? And just like you would maybe rate a driver in Uber, right? You just give a 5-point response. I feel not happy at all. I feel very happy. The one up here on the left side of the screen is a Dutch version. It's a free version of the app. And you just have 4 options to choose from. So it says, how do you feel at this moment? Happy, angry, afraid, sad. And the person chooses one of the 4. And what we know is in face-to-face teams, humans are pretty good at reading the emotions of their teams around them. They can tell, okay, Julie feels frustrated today. Samuel feels very engaged. But we tend to miss that data when we are in a virtual environment. And it's very important data. We know emotions are data, very important data for a team leader to have. And so by using these experience sampling apps, we can start to get at the end of the week, for example, get a mean level of frustration of our team, or feeling stressed in the team. And that can help us as leaders to understand, okay, what happened this week that might have made my team stressed? Do I need to have a conversation about this? What's also nice is that depending on the app you choose, you can see is if there's an outlier. So for example, maybe everyone is feeling pretty relaxed, except for Daniel, who reported low levels of feeling relaxed this week. You can reach out to Daniel and say what maybe happened that is making you feel less relaxed. Sebastian asked a good question. He said, any research showing how genuinely people would respond to these questions? It always has to do with motivation, right? So if you feel a high level of psychological safety with your team, which I hope most of us do in our teams, we tend to be fairly honest. But if we feel a low level of psychological safety, meaning trust that goes two ways in our teams, we might be less likely to be honest. But I think if you have low psychological safety, there are other issues that your team has to address, right? Before you start asking these questions, maybe having that face-to-face, or that not face-to-face, but that video conversation, first of all, of what are the rules of engagement, how open can we feel, how judged do we feel in this team, etc. So good question, Sebastian. I have another question here, and I will ask you, we talk about, introverts versus extroverts, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about introversion versus extroversion because I think most of us know it, but essentially it's how much energy we expect from the environment around us and how much energy we give out. So extroverts expect a lot of social energy around them. They thrive on social energy. They give out a lot of energy. Introverts tend to have a little bit of lower energy and they expect less energy. They give less energy off. And they also get energy from being alone, whereas extroverts get energy from being in a social environment. Who do you think, and this is the second poll question, who do you think is more important to have in your virtual team, the extroverts or the introverts? And I'm going to launch my second poll here. In your virtual team, launch by poll. Hopefully we see that. So hopefully you're seeing the poll now. Vote. Who do you think is more important? Barbara, interesting comment there. So introverted people tend to not speak as much during face-to-face meetings, but with virtual teams, they tend to shout out better. Oh, this is really interesting. I'm not sure of your first name. It's KR Huyi. And you said introverted people you find engage more when in a virtual environment. That's interesting you say that because I teach in our MBA program. It's 90 students from around the world. And we know that some cultures in general tend to be less vocal during class, like they never raise their hand. And I'm making stereotypes here, but in general, they never raise their hand and some cultures are always talking. But when we switch to virtual now, and I'm not saying that they're more introverted, but culturally, I find that these people are more comfortable giving their comments, especially when they can chat, when they are in the virtual world. So that's an interesting point. Introverts tend to like to work in isolation. Yeah, that's a really good point. So I think you can see the results now. 42% of you said introverts, 58% said extroverts. So we find that introverts are indeed more happy working in isolation or in virtual teams. They report more team satisfaction, which is important. But extroverts are necessary because they get that interaction going. And that's going to relate to my next slide that I'm going to show you as well. Extroverts tend to think aloud, so they tend to just talk more, so that open information sharing is more likely in a team full of extroverts than of introverts. And they tend to give off more energy. So you're going to have a more energetic interaction when you have some extroverts on the team than introverts. So for those of you who said a combination of both, I didn't want to give that option because it's kind of the cop-out. I wanted to get a conversation started, but essentially introverts are happier on the team. They tend to be more satisfied in virtual teams, but extroverts are needed to get that conversation going, that open information sharing. I'm going to stop sharing the poll and move on to the next slide. So when we think about interactions in real life, we have different ways of dealing with conflict, okay? And according to Thomas and Kilman, maybe you guys know this theory, there are 5 different ways of interacting around conflict in real life. The first one is avoidance, and this is just kind of apathetic involvement or even not involvement. I'm just going to step away. I'm going to avoid the interaction. We have accommodation, which is passive involvement in a group task. So I'm going to be there. I'm going to be present, but I'm just going to agree. I'm not really involved. I'm listening, but I'm not actually giving my opinions. And I'm also not holding things back. So I'm not hindering anything. We then have competition, pursuit of each member's own interests, power and dominance displays. So kind of a very competitive, as it says, environment. We have collaboration, so integrating outcomes of all parties involved, and then compromise. I'm going to acknowledge the differences in the group, and then we're going to agree on some middle ground. So in face-to-face teams, we know that some of these are less facilitative for team interactions than others. So for example, in the real world, we know avoidance is really negative. If I just step away, it's not helping team cohesion, it's not helping team interaction. It communicates, I don't care. And competition is very negative as well. It tends to increase the anger or the aggression in teams as a whole. It makes people feel less connected with one another, whereas collaboration and compromise are very positive. Accommodation tends to be neutral. It doesn't really have a negative or a positive effect. Now, in a virtual team, this tends to change, or this on average changes. In a virtual team, we see that avoidance, again, is negative, but so is accommodation. Avoidance and accommodation in a virtual world are perceived almost equally. People just see both of them as being disinterested, as not being involved, as not being engaged. Whereas collaboration is seen as positive again, so no change from the virtual world, but so is competition. Interestingly, whereas competition in the real world is seen negatively, in the virtual world, the competitive side isn't really perceived. It's more perceived as involvement and engaged and passionate. And whereas compromise is neutral, it kind of doesn't have an effect. So what I would like you to take away from this slide is not that you need to become more competitive in your virtual teams, but as one of my colleagues at another institution said, who used to act on stage, he said, I find virtual team interactions a bit like acting on stage. If you want someone to see that you're angry, you need to show 5 times more anger on your face or in your voice than in real life. If you're really happy, you need to smile more and to be more energetic in your voice. Otherwise, people don't perceive the happiness. So we said it's almost like acting on stage. And the effects of competition in a virtual team are sort of the same, is that because people tend to be really enthusiastic when they're very competitive, people read it as mere enthusiasm and passion rather than actually trying to be dominant or be, powerful relative to other members. So just maybe don't necessarily be more competitive in your virtual teams, but think about, how do I project and inject more passion and more involvement when I am interacting virtually than when I am interacting in a face-to-face environment. So I want to leave about 10 minutes for questions. Some takeaways that I want to leave you with from what we just spoke about. So in virtual teams, really think about how you can encourage that open information sharing, set the tone as a leader, give forced contributions, ask people to engage and think about different tools that you can use. If possible, first practice your virtual work face-to-face. Use virtual tools to take the emotional temperature of your team. And there's many out there. If you just type in experience sampling apps in a Google search, several will come up. Consider the personality composition of your team. Are you utilizing your extroverts to bring in energy and your introverts to bring in the satisfaction and willingness to go and work on their own? And satisfaction with that setup, as well as some of you said, maybe your introverts are going to be engaging more in this kind of environment. And as we saw from the last slide, kick your interaction up a notch in your virtual team so that people are feeling more engaged. I now have, as I said, about 10, 15 minutes for some questions. I want to address Alex's, and I'll then go to some of the other ones. So Alex said, what do you do in China where some of these tools aren't available? I think it's a great one. And it's certainly not one that I face on a daily basis here in Switzerland, but something I've thought about, especially not because I work in China or elsewhere, but because I work with companies often that don't allow certain apps to be on people's computers or on their phones. And I think in a situation like this, one of the best things you could do is have that conversation with your team and say, okay, we know that this open information sharing is important. how do we encourage open information sharing? What tools can we use? And kind of be creative and have that dialogue with your team. And it will, number one, will communicate that you care about this, that you want to encourage it, but also you will co-create ways to get around maybe the impediments that you have based on certain restrictions. Thank you, the silent message. I hope I can find the recording somewhere. How to get introvert persons. This is from Rhinus joining in. Do you need the right creative questions? So we know that introverts are not less engaged than extroverts. It just takes different things to get them stimulated. Certainly introverts will enjoy being alone and working on certain problems that they're passionate about. So I think those questions that might be directed towards them, that might show that you care about their opinion specifically, by saying, okay, Marcus, what do you think about this? I want to know, because of your experience on X project before, I want to know your opinion. So really singling them out can be very important. What do you think about virtual workshops? I recently used whiteboarding and it was amazing, Christopher says. So I think virtual workshops can be quite good. I've also used the whiteboarding app. I think that they can be, I mean, in the current world, sometimes that's all we have. So it's not a matter of what do I like it or not. I think one thing to think about when we are in a virtual workshop is to be very clear about why, like, what is the purpose of today's workshop and what are the objectives that we want to get to at the end, so that we can stay, on task. I guess it's the same with a virtual team meeting, but being clear about starting out with something that gets the conversation going. I would always think about in a virtual workshop, also, how do you ensure that everyone is involved in giving their opinions on it? And yes, you will get the recording. I'm trying to scroll through some more questions. Are there any recommendations about frequency for informal meetings for virtual teams as opposed to meetings with strict agendas? Casper, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I do know that virtual teams should meet face-to-face 4 times a year, if possible, in order to keep the team cohesion at a high level. But again, this was research done pre-COVID. Not sure if that still applies, but the old research said about 4 times a year was important. I think it's interesting if you say, okay, I wouldn't think about team meetings. Okay, we're gonna have a team meeting with no agenda versus a team meeting with agenda. But can I infuse both into every team meeting I have? So can I think about a way to have part of the meeting about just information sharing, more of an open agenda, and another part of it more of a set agenda? That's the way I would think about that. How can you, Saeed says, how can you practice corporate values in a virtual world? Oh, that's a really interesting one, especially interesting for me because that is one of the areas I study is corporate values. And I haven't thought about it so much, Saeed, in a virtual world, and maybe the rest of you could type in here what your ideas are. But I think it's always important to start off as the leader, any sentence with restating a corporate value. So this is what I tell my face-to-face teams, is that if you want people to start living your corporate values, begin your sentences underlining what that corporate value is. So for example, if you want people to be more engaged in your team meetings, let's say, you could say something like, as our value of collaboration stakes, it's really important that all of us be engaged with our cameras on in the team meeting. Or because being entrepreneurial is a value that our company has, I would like you to go out and do X. So starting as a leader, starting your sentences by embedding the value behind what you're asking for, what you're recommending, so that that value becomes just part of the corporate vernacular. And it is something that every team member sees the relevance of and actually can live it on a daily basis. I like this, Albert. I'm not sure if this is the same Albert in Melbourne that's drinking the wine. So I'm not sure if I should trust your questions at this point. I don't know how many glasses you've had by now, but what role does trust or quick trust play in virtual teams? A huge value. So I didn't get into trust building in the virtual world, but we know that trust comes from 3 places. Care. So how much care do I show to you? How much do I empathize with you? How much do I show interest in your well-being. Second one, certifiable me. How authentic am I? Am I vulnerable? Am I sharing things that are personal? And then lastly, number 3, competence. Am I showing that I can fulfill what I promise, that I'm going to be able to fulfill a task, that I have experience, that I have expertise? So care, certifiable me, and competence. And we know that some of these are easier to do in the virtual world than others. So for example, that care, while it's harder to show empathy, it's actually easier to have touch points with various members of your team through different modes. Or certifiable me, it's easier to share like little snippets of your life when you are in the virtual world. So you can, for example, you see my background, you see more into my life. Maybe my son will walk through the screen sometimes on a meeting. I see more authentic. Or with competence, we see that it's easier to speak about our achievements without actually having to boast ourselves. So for example, with LinkedIn, I can post an article I've just written without having to say in a meeting, like, did you see the article that I just wrote? So those are easier in the virtual world, but we also know that some are harder. If we want to think about building instantaneous trust, a way to do that is by recognizing something about that person that you either see in the meeting or have recognized from the work that you've done between virtual meetings. So for example, if you're talking to me, Albert, you see a picture in the background. It has like a blue, other side. It has a blue frame, it's right there. By asking something like, oh, I see a picture in your background. Who is that? Or what is that? I'm going to start open information sharing. And I'm also going to be impressed maybe that you're interested in something that is in my life, and I'm going to feel more connected with you. So that's one way in a virtual meeting to get that instantaneous trust. Another one is to look for points of similarity. So we know that we trust people that are like us more than people that are dislike us. That's just how we've evolved as humans. In-group members more than out-group members. So highlighting something that is similar to you. So, if you hear a screaming baby in the background saying like, oh, my husband and I just had a baby 5 months ago. And we also are dealing with the screaming baby. How is that, right? So trying to find these points of similarity. The anonymous attendee, interesting name your parents gave you, anonymous, says, do you think there is a generation gap in being able to manage virtual teams effectively? And by answering this, I'm going to sound very stereotypical, but yes. So what I don't like about those I forget what they're called, trip and something videos around virtual interactions, the one we watched at the beginning, is that they tend to be stereotypical in the sense that the older gentleman is always the one that's struggling with technology, but we know that there is indeed some truth to that. So younger individuals, and when I do a longer session in my program on leading in the digital age, on building trust in the virtual world, I talk about the fact that generation millennials and generation Z's, the one that comes after them, are more likely to say, I could see myself being friends or connecting with a robot.
So hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining in today on the 15th of May for the webinar on Leading Virtual Teams 2.0. Apologies for that last part. We're not sure what happened. We're checking with IT right now. So I apologize that I couldn't give you a proper goodbye and a thank you live, but recording this anyhow and wishing you a good weekend. If you are interested in this topic, as I said, this is a snippet of a longer, this time virtual course that I will be giving at the end of June called Leading in the Digital Age. So if you're interested in this, please sign up for that course. There's coaching involved. It's going to be super interesting, great guest speakers. Hoping to see you there, and thank you again. Goodbye.